Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to Life of Riley's March webinar, Challenging Our Assumptions, the intersection of storytelling and data. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chaitana, and I am the Program Director for Life of Riley, the Animal Welfare Initiative of Spring Point Partners. It's like a lot of you, throughout my career in animal protection, I've tried to discern what the data tells us about the nature of the welfare challenge I'm working on at any given time. And I've tried to use that data to inform the design of strategies, programs, and campaigns. And especially when looking at kind of global or huge national animal welfare challenges, I, like all of you, am looking for data that will tell me whether our programs and campaigns are actually making a difference for animals and moving the needle in the right direction, especially given the fact that some of these problems, like factory farming, may not be solved in my lifetime. But I also know that data doesn't give us the full picture of either the problem or the progress being made to solve it. And while relying exclusively on stories and anecdotes can introduce bias, data isn't unbiased either. So I'm grateful that my colleague, Gretchen Mielke, Springpoint's Director of Data, is going to lead us through an exploration of the assumptions, limitations, and opportunities data can provide us as we try to understand complex animal welfare problems and both design and evaluate initiatives to solve them. She's been a tremendous asset to all of us working on a whole range of issues within the organization at Springpoint. So I'm very kind of proud and happy to be able to that we can share her expertise with you today. So without further ado, Gretchen, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I am going to just pull up my deck here. One moment. Okay, can everyone see my this lovely blue screen here?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Wonderful. So thank you so much for the warm welcome. Really excited to be here with my Life of Riley friends and our other partners who are joining us from around the country. I've really been excited to, some of you are familiar faces since May, and so it's nice to see some of you again as well. So I'm really excited. So today we're here to discuss, challenging our assumptions and the intersection of storytelling and data. There are also wonderful experts in the room. So I'm just excited for the conversation that we get to have and to kind of bring data to life as you experience it in your everyday. So before we get started into like the real meat here, I just wanted to give us a grounding of the definition. So really, what is data? Data is raw, unprocessed facts without context. And it really doesn't become information until we give it context and meaning. And that's, I think, even more important is that when we add it to experience and action, that's when it becomes knowledge. So before, if you don't mind, I'd love if I could have one or two people come off mute and just share an example of data that you trust and why. And then we'll do someone share an example of trust example of data you don't trust and why. So if someone could raise their hand, we can have you come off mute and jump right in. An example of data you trust. Any brave individuals want to share? All right, we're going to be shy. We'll take a minute. We can also come back to you on this. We'll come back here. So, for example, what we are hoping to find as well as also data sets that people like and want to share and resources that might be helpful for the community.
We have
We got a
actually,
couple in the
Gretchen, people
chat.
did want to share. We have people in the
Okay,
chat. I'm sorry, I
in the
wasn't
chat.
watching the chat.
Okay, let's
Um,
do Julia. Julia, come off mute and share.
I think one of the first things I look for data that I can trust is the source of that data. So I guess I have through my own experience determined what I believe to be like reputable sources of data. And so one of the first things I'm looking at is where is the data coming from? And then kind of how is what's being shared with me, like what is the source of that data to? Is this something that was collected, um, in a manner that kind of has external validation to it? Is it more anecdotal, kind of like doing a little bit of a assessment of those kind of questions when I think about data I can trust?
Love that. That's so helpful and so important for sure is where's it coming from and what makes that a trusted source? Anybody want to share an example of data you don't trust and why? I'll jump in. The US Census data, right? Yeah, it is mass collected. There's a lot of fear in communities about filling it out, right? So it becomes like a lot of missing gaps of information of people who don't feel comfortable and they're worried about their data being shared across government agencies. And so that would be a great example of like, yes, it's nice to know, and yes, it's informing a lot of things, but there's also some real concerns with that data set. So. Great. Well, we are warmed up now. Your toes are toasty. We are ready to participate in future sessions here, future slides. But let me just jump right back in. So what we're here today to do is to talk about the assumptions, limitations, opportunities, and I'm hoping that we can practice the critical eye to our data landscape. So participants will explore case studies about how data might be able to be used, but also the intersection of where stories can be used to fill in the gaps and provide some really effective, storytelling along the way. So some of the assumptions that we're going to kind of peel apart today is data is neutral, data is factual, data does not lie, data is all-knowing, all data is scientifically rigorous, and AI has all the answers. And we're going to do this through 3 case studies. I think from timing today and depending how the conversation goes, we may only hit the first 2. But depending if, we're kind of moving fast, we'll hit into AI as well. So scenario number 1, data is all knowing. Scenario number 2, putting forward an initiative. So also, like fun fact, just kind of keep warming each other up. If you all could help me and throw into this chat, what kind of dog is this? And how do you know? This is not a test, so don't be shy.
I'm watching the chat, but I'm guessing like a lot of people. Is anyone going to even make a guess? I have no idea what kind of dog that is. It's cockapoo.
A cockapoo. Okay, cool. I love it. Oh,
Yes,
Grace
more
also said
cockapoos.
cockapoo. Lots of cockapoos. Okay. The world's worst breed guesser. Okay, I love that. Awesome. Yes. So Brussels Griffon mix. Absolutely. Yeah. So the whole point of this is just a fun, silly question to show that in fact data is not simple, right? Data is not easy. So what should be a very simple question, what kind of dog is this, is actually complicated. And how do we know? So you're right, it could be a Brussels Griffon. It's a mix. I think this is my friend's dog. They actually DNA tested these 2, and they're like 40 different dogs. And one of them looks like a Cocker Spaniel. The other one has more Havanese in them. There's some Chihuahua in here. And the idea of like how you agree and how you fill this out on a broad survey really comes to play later when we're doing our reporting. So it's important to really think about like who's filling in the information and what codes may or may not go into it. So another example here, another thing to play with. So let's pretend that we're, a shelter intake employee and we have a dog coming in and we want to know why the dog is being surrendered. And so I have a fake story here and I want you all to think about what would you code this as the reason that the dog is being surrendered. So last month I lost my mom who's been dealing with a long-term illness. Joey was her dog and unfortunately did not have the ability right now, financially or my shared housing, to take on a dog at this moment. So recently, I've noticed that he has a very large tumor that's growing on his side and that we're really concerned about. I do not have the money to take care of his needs and hope that I can find him a good home that can love him the way my mom did. So, what would you code the reason in your system as to why this dog was being surrendered? And you can throw it in the chat.
We're a really small group, so you guys can also just yell things out, unmute yourself and yell things out, because this is a small group today.
Financial, cost of veterinary care, death of owner, death of owner and medical concerns. Absolutely. So again, housing, yes. So what's important about this moment, and the reason I wanted to start off with these kind of small but silly examples, is that when we're coding a survey, we're trying to figure out what answer to a question is. Data is meant to simplify in a lot of ways, right? So sometimes you might only be able to put in one answer. So there might be multiple factors and really important information that would affect, your knowledge and understanding and depth of understanding of why a dog is being surrendered or a cat or an animal. And having this ability to share more might be where stories come in. It might be where other information of kind of widening the tools might be helpful, but not all tools are set up for these kind of multiple answers. And so when we're thinking about what we're hearing in these large, large, large data sets, if the answer is sort of a single question with a single potential input, as you see in our small group and community here today, there's lots of different answers. And so that information, that trust in that information becomes a little less accurate and as we're affecting a larger data set. So data can't be all-knowing. There has been a push in the last decade to focus on collecting and sharing data and making data-informed decisions in animal welfare. We use numbers to justify programs, prove impact, and influence policy. But how do we know that this is happening? And what might these numbers be leaving out? So there are some major mistakes that are being made that impacts how data can be used. Large data sets can be problematic and messy. Shelters collect intake questions, but those questions might vary. And also, how someone might answer those questions and that reliability and consistent responses may also vary across individuals and organizations. Not from ill intent and maybe not even from lack of training, but from a lack of agreement between organizations across the country or across the world. Sometimes the question lands wrong, and so data is important and data should be informed, but data is not all-knowing, and that researchers and organizations should be articulating the limitations of our data, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. So just a note there, sometimes we like to, we're appealing to donors and so on and so forth, and so we may not necessarily say our limitations, but it's also just really good practice. So this is a completely fake data set. This is just an opportunity to, again, play with what voices or experiences might this data not represent. So if you look through this, there is some animal ID numbers, the species, the intake month, the intake type, age, sex, are they altered or not, the length of stays, the outcome type, the outcome month, and then region or a medical flag. So from your experience, whose voices or experiences aren't in this data? And you can come off mute and shout it out. Okay, we've got shelter personnel. Excellent. Wonderful. There could be geographies not represented here, right? So when we talk about region R1, R2, are most of these areas, showing a rural, are we missing a rural perspective? Are they, reporting from an urban area? If this is a rural survey that we're missing some of urban perspectives. And so it's really, really helpful. Why is the question we asked before, why is an animal being surrendered? We don't really know that in this question. So, an animal being a stray. So the individuals who are coming in and putting dogs into, providing I can't speak, transferring in the animal, their information is not here. Foster placements, if there's some foster information, and that also might be helpful here. So vets who might work with the shelters. So original birth of dog, where it came from. Absolutely, Stacy. So I think thinking about the fact that when we set up our data and how we do our evaluation, there will be voices missing and making sure we're, again, acknowledging those limitations and who's not represented. The reason I say this is, and I know you all may already know all of this information, and we're just starting off here at the starting point. But data has a really long, complex history. And it's often hidden, and there's a history of harm here that has been caused by data collection, analysis, and surveillance. And so these impacts are not just historic, but active, present, and ongoing. So who the data represents is a really critical question, and there are very good reasons for lower response rates and active avoidance of participants in our studies. And so individuals may not want to be, to participate, to share. They may have concerns about how you might use the data or might not trust you at all. You might appear, for example, to look like someone official or from a government or law enforcement agency. Are you going to share this information with my housing? And maybe I shouldn't have an animal here. Additionally, with new technologies, with some biases encoded and privacy may not be guaranteed in some ways, there may be a lot of good reasons as to why someone may not participate in our data. And just acknowledging that we have this history. So, for example, Skull Wars, this is a book that came out in the 1990s. It's about the Kennewick Man, and it talks about the history of exploitation in our work, in our research, and the scientific study of skulls, for example, of various races. So it's called craniology. And phrenology in 1810 and 1840 was a pseudoscience that really was trying to determine personality, intellect, character traits by measuring these skulls. And so in 1996, Kennewick Man was a 9,000-year-old man who was found in Washington state. And there was a legal battle between the scientists who wanted to study him, and the tribes claiming it for reburial. And so while science is valuable, it needs to be balanced with the moral and legal respect of our Indigenous history and culture. And so even though NAGPRA was passed in 1990, unfortunately, as of 2025, museums have only processed and returned 48% of human remains and 71% of funerary objects. So that leaves about 100,000 remains that are still repatriated. And so it's going to take another 70 to 200 years to complete it at a current pace. And so there's lots of examples. And again, I'm probably talking to a room of like-minded individuals. There are lots of examples of harm that have happened because of data in our communities. And as we're thinking about involving, participatory research and involving communities into our research, it's really important that those protections are in place. But how might you cause unintended harm through your data collection, whether you're talking about your active data collection right now, but also in adjacent areas of justice? So how do we make sure that we're not just looking at animal welfare, but also the human spectrum of animal welfare versus economic justice? So I wanted to just give you another minute or two to answer that question or come off mute if you have any thing that you want to share around an area that you might cause unintended harm in your data practices. So you could raise your hand or throw it in your chart. Survey bias. Thank you, Catherine. Absolutely. When people hyperfocus on one part of the data rather than the whole set. Absolutely, Kristen. A small sample represents a lot of members of a group. Absolutely. Okay, awesome. One of the things here I just want to note is that this is complex. The problems we're trying to solve is complex. Data itself is meant in some ways to be a simplifier, as I mentioned before. How can we make meaning out of all these complex things that are happening? And let's ask a question that maybe can shave off understanding into that one particular piece. But if we're not looking at the other areas, for example, it might be impactful. So if we have, for example, the Philadelphia, breeding practices, for example, and economic justice, those might collide as well. So how do we ensure that our practices are really helping the full spectrum of justice where both animals and humans are benefiting? And so we can get stuck into our silos in some ways. And I think with data as well, making sure that we're providing as much, complexity as we can when we're working with telling our stories. So some common data limitations that we find and that we see are related to incomplete data. So whether there's underreporting, missing values, biased results, analytical accuracy, the limited sample size. So for example, I actually have seen this, in some of our work as well when They don't kind of share what the N is and how many participants have practiced. So they're making really big claims of, oh, we're doing this, but there just isn't any awareness into how big the study was or what was the sample size of the individuals or the animals they worked with. The data bias that we just talked about, there might be a lack of granularity. So maybe it's too aggregated and you're not able to get down to the root causes of an issue because the information is in a yearly impact and not in a weekly or daily impact. That there's inconsistent definitions and metrics across, the teams and sources and just inaccurate comparisons. You're kind of still comparing apples and oranges and you're not really activating. And so like even at Spring Point, one of the first things that we've been doing in a data committee is defining what's a grant, what's a gift, and just making sure that everyone is counting it in the same way. And that will really help with reporting on the other end. Limited historic data, graphical gaps. Maybe we have some bigger understanding of this particular region, but we're missing more information, across our constituents. Data access and regulations and privacy, we might not just be able to access it. There's lots of great data questions that we might have interest in, but we actually might not be able to get actually access to that data. We work in education, for example. We are working with kids, and you just can't go and ask children questions. That's not allowed. And so that information might be a good thing to collect. It actually might be the right place to go. But in fact, we are not allowed and should not be asking that for regulatory reasons. Integration questions, there might be some issues combining data between systems and formats. Unstructured or poorly structured data, PDFs consistently give me a tweak because it's a lot of manual input to get that information into our data, as well as lack of context or metadata. So if we're missing explanations of how, when, or why data is collected, there is obviously a risk of misinterpretation, and we'll kind of come back there. Before we jump on, I just want to open up space. Does anything strike you about these conclusions? Do you want to share anything about these conclusions or limitations here? What strikes you as interesting?
Gretchen, I'd like to add, if it's okay. So I'm with PACT, Operation Foster. So I think with us, we're working with veterans deployed, as well as folks who are returning or seeking mental health support or other crisis. So we're dealing with often sensitive information that we have to share what the story is, but we have to be very sensitive and very limited in what we share while we're seeking a match, that we have to find a right match to foster their pet while they're healing, right? So we're in this place of like sharing the right amounts respectfully that they have allowed us to, but not sharing too much.
Absolutely. And that's crucial. And that's what builds trust, right? So, in that notion of voices represented or not, the more that you're being a trusted partner and safeguarding their information or stories where needed and sharing, protecting their information will again build trust with your communities who will be more interested in participating in the future or who may be open to sharing more stories when we get to that as well. So, thank you so much for coming off mute and sharing. That's wonderful. Anyone else? Okay. We got skeptical of any data or limited understanding of these other limitations. Yes, thank you, Rebecca. So these are important. And again, because it's about asking, what questions do we want to be critical of any data set? So I think there is sometimes this like, oh my gosh, it's mathy. My brain stopped working. I turned it off. I do not. Oh, that data, they must have got it, right? I think there's something about like a moment where we become a little less critical depending on how the information is presented. And so I want us to have these critical questions in our toolkit. So, what's the purpose of this data set? Why does this data set exist? Tracking performance, identifying trends, are we informing decisions? What time period does it cover? I did some research on the insurrection and the elections and back in 2020. And, asking questions about democracy before then maybe is different than asking about questions of democracy today, for example. And so I think really thinking like time period does matter and making sure, is it current? Is it relevant? Is the information even the same? Who collected the data? What was their expertise? Who or what was represented in this data? What was the sample size? Who was included or excluded? What was their methodology? Was it the appropriate research design? Are there any known issues with the data? What questions that does this data not answer? Penny's talking about reliable sources have changed over the past 5 years. That is so true. So true. You know what I miss the most? Side fact. You know how Google Scholar used to say this is how many times this was cited, or Google would tell you that leadership was like searched a million times, and you were like, okay, great. And all of that is different now. So there is some definite, change of technology and reliable sources for sure. Are the definitions consistent? I keep going back to that one. It's a good starting point for me and all of my work. What question am I trying to answer? Known biases, margins of error, any unintended consequences that may impact the researcher or research participants. So, when should we not use data is going to be just basically the opposite of this. If there's research design mismatch, if you're seeing definitional disagreement, if there's lots of holes and gaps and you're missing voices, that's not to say that there isn't important value of data that is very small and targeted, right? This is not to say don't touch and don't try to research. We can't answer any of these questions. It's actually meant to be the opposite. It's not to overstate what your data can do, to being really clear. This is a small sample size. This is what we found for our research. If it is a small sample size under, let's say, 250 people, where it's not going to be statistically significant, stories are your best. They're your favorite. That's where you're going to start talking about case studies. That's where you're going to start, really looking at qualitative research. And so we'll come into that. For example, purposeful sampling, that would be a rich case that the whole point is to just look at the depth and detail and understand and illuminate those cases. You're not trying to generalize to the population as a whole. It's really just about extrapolating the findings that are really specific to your specific situation. And so just being really careful that you're not overgeneralizing to keeping that your arguments are just mindful of what the data is meant to do. In qualitative research, keeping the findings in context is absolutely the cardinal rule. We see a lot of differences in quantitative research. There are some open data, open research, open data sets, particularly in the health and sciences. And so if we are dealing with those kind of open research data sets, there's a need for proactive data curators and intermediaries who can really provide a lot of contextual information about the data set and guidelines for reuse, guidelines that encourage the descriptions. How did you deal with secondary analysis of data replication, so that they can reproduce your results and give credit that there's data stewardship guidelines, and also any community agreements with local communities would be important. Common misuse that comes from kind of these open data sets or just in general would be analytical errors, misinterpretations, misrepresentation, reputational harm, and privacy. The uncritical reuse of bias and offensive data. And we do see some of this happening with environmental data and indigenous data as well. So where can stories fill in? So there's this paradox. There's this data, you want data when you kind of get into this over-reliance on anecdote. If there's too much data, then you need to have more understanding of the context and better understand, tell me why is that happening? Tell me what's happening here. And so I really am a big proponent of mixed methods. It gives you more of a complete understanding of the research problems. And that storytelling, where that could come in, is that storytelling is a narrative technique that can be used within qualitative research to convey findings and engage the audience on personal or impactful issues related to a topic area. In fact, there's this poet who shares, "The universe is made of stories, not atoms," which I thought was a lovely quote to add today to our topic. So let's play with this a little bit. So let's just start off with a general statement. Let's say this is from a shelter. Through stronger partnerships with local residents, volunteers, and businesses, the shelter became a shared community space rather than a last resort. Outreach events, foster networks, and transparent storytelling help people see the animals as individuals, increasing trust and participation. As engagement grew, rehoming rates rose, creating a virtuous cycle where community involvement directly translated into better outcomes for animals. What is wrong with this? It's teasing you. It's completely teasing you. Look at all these references to outcomes, and we're increasing trust and we're increasing participation. Don't you want to know, like, how much did you increase trust? How much did you increase participation? Wait, what were those better outcomes that you're talking about, right? So it's begging for more data. It's saying, please give me some numbers. I want some numbers, please. And so this is a great example of taking this amazing statement that you're trying to make about your events and your outcomes, and then adding in some data. Maybe we add the percent increase in attendees that are reporting, trust. Maybe we add in the percent who are willing to volunteer, or the numbers of people who feel personally connected to at least one animal. So, wouldn't data be cool? Let's raise our hands. It's cool. Show me some love here. We're all engaged. Absolutely. We love some data. Okay, so here's the fun part. So, this intersection with storytelling, right? So, if we found a story that can highlight also this shared trust, this building of trust, this, oh, look at my shelter becoming a shared community. That makes it so much cooler. You're like, oh, let's tug at the heartstrings. So let's find a great story. So at the shelter's open house, Eleanor hovered near the doorway, hands folded tight, certain the cats could sense her lifelong fear and scatter. Then Joy, a calm, gray-eyed cat with a soft, patient purr, climbed into her lap as if she'd always belonged there, turning Eleanor's trembling into laughter. By the time the event ended, Eleanor signed the adoption papers with a steady hand, thinking as Joy leaned into her chest, now I feel less alone. Right? Is your emotions tugged at? Are you just like, oh, Eleanor, you found joy. You guys like a love match. You feel less alone. That's lovely, right? So when we marry that together, and you started off with this like narrative statement, you added in some really cool data, and then you added a story, it's like a beautiful little triangle of fun and impact, right? So building trust, growing participation, changing lives. And then you've got the stats. We've seen a 42% increase in the trust of our shelter. That's showing that increased confidence. We see 36% are more willing to participate and foster and donate. We see 68% are feeling an emotional connection. And then you've got Eleanor and Joy's story on the left. So to have all three together really paints a more complex picture. It paints the ability to share, outcomes plus data plus story. And I think it appeals to an audience in a different way. So just a fun little triage here. Okay, I want to jump to our second scenario. We're doing great with time. You guys are being great. Thanks for being patient with me. I want to just share this action research with you all as a tool. If you're already doing it, great. If you have ideas that you want to kind of play with as we're going, this is kind of a speed round for me. So the goal is to really think about, what is an initiative that you're thinking of and how data can be used in early stage design as you're thinking about, we want to make a change. We want to put forward a policy change. What data might be helpful for you in that baseline? So I come from international development, and we like a good monitoring and evaluation plan. And so this idea is kind of pieces of those that I just want to share with you. So on your piece of paper, if you have one, if on your computer, if you're typing, if you want to throw it in the chat, also would love to see it. What's an initiative that you're thinking about putting forward to make a change? And you can just take a minute and write it down. What would be your research problem or question? For what purpose? Are you looking to influence change or policy, change a practice, change a mindset? Then you'd identify the stakeholders involved, who needs to become active early in this process, and whose voices need to join the study. Are there partners that you would work with in the community? Are there other collaborators, other organizations, community, government? Project logic is my favorite. So when we think a lot about mission drift, right? Sometimes we have funders who might come in and they might say, hey, we are going to fund this. And you're like, oh, I can create a program like this. Let me add that on. So this idea about, are your project activities aligned with the change that you're intending to make? So if your goal is to, increase adoption rates, right? Do your activities align with that goal? Or are you starting to see some of your activities that were kind of add-ons that maybe aren't effectively making that happen? Or we thought they were going to be effective, but they aren't. And so that they're no longer as aligned. So project logic is just something, helpful to think about. And then data. What data do you need and how would you establish the baseline? So I'm going to check the chat here. I just want to see if anybody is going to has played with us out. Does anyone want to share an idea that they want to put forward or change they're looking to make? Or we can just keep discussing the monitoring plan, no problem. All right, we're going to keep rolling. We might get to AI after all. And that's my soapbox, everybody. So as we get to a monitoring and evaluation plan, what's really helpful when you're doing a baseline and thinking about a change you want to make is thinking about, oh, there is some people in the chat. Sorry. Reliable sources, data and details, no metrics. Do you subsidize spay and neuter? Okay. Thank you for that. Sorry, we missed your participation on that side. Okay, so coming back to monitoring and evaluation plan, what indicators are being monitored and tracked? And if those are indicators, if, let's say spay and neuter, right? You want to know what information is needed to track that. What are the sources of the information? What data collection methods are appropriate? Who will collect the information and how often will it be collected? Who will receive and use the results? How much will the data collection cost? What are the anticipated relationships between your activities, your inputs, and your outcomes? And then what's the communication plan for outreach and dissemination of research? And then in the monitoring and evaluation plan, you would also include a conceptual framework. What is your program's hypotheses? What are those assumptions that we're talking about that you're making? What does the literature say about the indicators that you are putting forward? And what's your theory of change? Like, what, if you do this, what result are you anticipating to then reach your long-term goal? And for monitoring, you would add in your monitoring procedures, your evaluation procedures, and any reporting procedures that are related. So how are we feeling? Do you want me to do my AI soapbox? Are you all ready for this? I can speed through it. I see Julia shaking her head yes. Anyone else? Okay, we're gonna get soapy here. Okay, AI research. So throw in an emoji about AI. I just am taking a gauging your interest and feelings right now. All right, we'll catch up with you on those. Hopefully those will come through in the chat. Okay, so if we're talking about AI, I want to add in this lovely kind of story. So let's say that A and B are both fluent speakers of English, and they're independently stranded on two uninhabited islands. And they discover that previous visitors to those islands have left behind telegraphs, and they can communicate with each other via an underwater cable. So A and B start happily typing messages to each other. While O is a hyper-intelligent deep-sea octopus who is unable to visit or observe the two islands. And they discover a way to tap into an underwater cable and listen in on A and B's conversations. O knows nothing about English initially, but is very good at detecting statistical patterns. So over time, O learns to predict with great accuracy how B will respond to each of A's utterances. So soon, the octopus enters the conversation and starts impersonating B and replying to A. And this ruse works for a minute. A believes that O communicates as both she and B do, with meaning and intent. And then one day, A calls out, "I'm being attacked by an angry bear. Help me figure out how to defend myself. I've got some sticks." The octopus impersonating B fails to help. How could it succeed? The octopus has no reference, no ideas what bears or sticks are, no way to give relevant instructions, like to go grab some coconuts and a rope and build a catapult. A is in trouble and feels duped. The octopus is exposed as a fraud. So I just wanted to show, oh, I love all those emojis. I'm back to not sharing my screen here. One moment. So for this scenario, AI has some limitations. And so just to kind of think about the fact that the octopus does not know how to speak English, doesn't have the reference for what's on the island. And so when we come to making decisions, keep in mind that AI is kind of like this octopus. It was originally created, almost like an Excel-based tool. And so, what does your data need? Are you looking for qualitative answers? Are you looking for quantitative answers? It is not truly effective yet. Not saying it can't grow to be. It's changing very fast every day for qualitative research and why context and nuance and motivations and feelings matter. And what is the data source? Where do you need the data to come from? Are we talking about peer-reviewed academic journals, or are we talking about the whole of the internet? And if it's the whole of the internet, there are biases that are encoded in the models that we just want to be careful about. The diversity of content creators and who the humans represented in the internet are overrepresent white people, men, wealth, and that there is a lot of racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and it kind of freezes in time and locks in some of the problems of the past. So just something to think about is how do we track the errors and inaccuracy? It needs human review. And then as well about impacts with things around environmental usage, electricity, and carbon emissions. And so just something to think about as far as, regulations and oversights and liability, that AI is powerful, but we've learned and need to learn that we can make machines that can mindlessly generate text, but we haven't learned how to stop imagining the mind behind it. And so AI has some incredible tools and opportunities, but it is actually not necessarily quote unquote intelligent, and that we need to make sure that we're using it and putting it within the ethics that make sense with our mission. So in closing, data is awesome. It has some limitations. Our assumptions are not neutral or factual. It's not all knowing. But if you bring critical questions and a critical lens to this work, it really has such an incredible tool to deepen our sense making and engagement. Action research is a great opportunity to kind of standardize and build indicators and collections up front. And AI also has some exponential opportunities, but be sure to think of strategic use cases and guardrails that will suit you, your mission, and your policies. So I'm really excited to, hopefully continue the conversation in the future, but I appreciate your kind attention today. There is this lovely survey tool here, if you wouldn't mind. If you, take a picture of the QR code, it'll open up the survey, and then you can walk through the questions. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Gretchen. I need a few more minutes of everyone's time. All right, so I just want to talk. So I know you're all sitting here and saying it was an amazing presentation. Thanks, Chaitna. But other than the fact that you were a data nerd, why is it that why is it that this was information that was so important for Life of Riley to share, right? And it is because we are looking at data all the time and all of the issues that all of us on the screen are working on. Whether we're trying to look at why is it that animals are coming into the shelter and what type of interventions do we need to stop animals from coming into the shelter? What is it? Are people losing housing? Are people breeding dogs, too many dogs? Is it a financial issue? Is it an education issue? So we're trying to design, and is it a mix of things? And we're trying to design interventions to solve that problem. We're seeing problems across sectors in the agricultural industry. We're seeing challenges in kind of the dog breeding and the pet sector in terms of animal welfare challenges. So how do we have to fully understand the problem in order to design great interventions from it. That's something that we struggle with a lot at Life of Riley. And there's a lot of confusing data out there. And so what does it mean to really be data driven? It's actually a lot more complicated. We're finding that it's a lot more complicated than we thought it would be. And to know that we're making an impact, that is also something that we are really struggling to measure. So we're really grateful to have Gretchen to help us think through these issues, but in the coming year, I think I told you at the last webinar that this was going to be a year focused on data for Life of Riley. I'd like to invite all of you to kind of join us. And whatever issue that we're working on, whether it's addressing shelter populations or looking at inhumane practices in the dog breeding industry. Let's look at what data are we using to define the problem and to design interventions, and what data are we collectively as a movement using to check whether we're actually making progress on the issue and whether or not we're actually having an impact. So that's a little bit of my soapbox that I invite you to join us on. So reach out to me next month. So we will not have a webinar in April, but our next webinar will be on May 21st. One of the things that Gretchen mentioned in this webinar is that data, for better or for worse, really simplifies things. But all of the animal welfare issues we discuss at Life of Riley are influenced by a range of social issues outside of our sector. And any interventions that we design are likely to impact the broader social landscape, even beyond animals. And data doesn't always capture that complexity. But at our next webinar, which is going to be on May 21st, JBR Strategies is going to present information that kind of captures that complexity from the perspective of dog breeding. So this is a continuation of JBR's presentation at Life of Riley's virtual conference last fall. They're really going to use a mix of data and storytelling to better understand the animal welfare problems in the dog breeding sector and to design more effective interventions. So stay tuned for our follow-up email for the registration link to the next webinar, and also a link to the recording for today's webinar. Thanks, Gretchen. There's so much rich information in today's webinar that I know that I'm going to be going back and listening to it again and again as we kind of make our way through our year of data here at Life of Riley with our partners and really think about how are we defining problems and measuring impact. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for continuing to be a part of Life of Riley's community. I look forward to seeing you all in May. And in the meantime, please do reach out if you want to talk about anything data or animals or anything else. Thanks so much. Bye.